We'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast was produced, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present.
After 254 days, Bonnie Hancock has finally made it back to her hometown of Mermaid Beach on the Gold Coast. She spent the last 8 months paddling a surf ski around the entire coast of Australia. She's travelled 12,700 kilometres, overcome seasickness, sharks, crocodiles, 6-metre swells, and come scarily close to hypothermia. Here, at the end of her journey, she's broken numerous world records, but they're not the thing she's most proud of. Her biggest achievement is testing the limits of what she can do. I'm Matt Middleton. You're listening to Head Game. Today, what it takes to find the mental strength to reach what you're truly capable of. Bonnie, welcome to Head Game. Now, you're a professional iron woman. You've broke multiple world records. You're just hardcore. And I look at some of the world records that you've broken, which we'll get into later on in the podcast. But have you always been hardcore? Take me back to where all this sort of physical and psychological sort of resilience comes from.
Absolutely. So I grew up in the tiny little town of Stott. It's, population 2,000 people. It's in New South Wales, and I'm one of 4 girls. So I'm third in line, and I was always physically the smallest. So I remember from a young age just wanting to compete and I think prove myself. And I remember my older sisters daring me to do different crazy things in our backyard and with the kids around the street. So it did start young.
And of course you done them, right? Of course you were like, I've got to prove to my older sisters, and I've got to prove that I'm the...
Absolutely. And I think that sort of, competitiveness carried on. And at the age of 5, my parents pretty much threw me into the surf to do nippers. And I remember just being so excited to take my little boogie board out the back in the huge swells of Coffs Harbour and them having to hold me back just a little bit.
Did you just learn from what you saw? Because at that age, you learn by example, don't you? Did you just take to it, just look around you, take the environment in, take everything in, and just thought, right, this is where I'm living and this is what I'm going to do?
That's exactly right. I watched my older sisters, and so you go on to a little sort of bit, maybe twice the size of a boogie board to start in nippers. It's called a foamy board, and I remember watching them on those foamy boards and being so excited for when I could transition off my little boogie board. And when you're third in line, you never get given anything new. It's hand me down.
Yes, I'm a hand me down kid as well.
Right.
I'm third down as well. I've got 2 older brothers, so listen, I feel your pain. I feel your pain.
Right. I remember getting this foamy board, and it was my older sister George's, and it was the most special thing in the world to me. It had so many little dints in it, but it felt new. And I remember my first session just taking that board out, and I would train while the sisters were training in the actual club squad. I would train next to them and kind of try to race them. Amazing. So, the competitiveness started young.
Yeah, I can see that. And I appreciate that as well. And because I'm the same. And it's weird because when you got the hand-me-downs, even though they were, they were battered, had chunks out of them, I always looked after them. I had hand-me-down trainers that I would just because I wanted them for my brother. I was like, I'm going to get them soon. And when I got them, I'd really take care of it, really look after what was handed down to me. And it's strange because they would just use and abuse it, and then it got to you, and you'd be like, wow, I've got this now.
Absolutely. I'm sure they didn't wash it after training or anything like that, and it had run into a few other boards. And I then remember when I was 11 years old, getting my very first little sponsorship when I won a race on the board at the state titles, and that was just so special. And I think coming from really humble beginnings, you just appreciate every opportunity you get, everything you get given to you, just even that little bit more.
Wow, did you say at 11 you won a state championship?
I did. So, you start competing young in surf life saving. From the age of 8, you're actually able to do the state titles. So you do what's called a wade race, which is more like running out around waist depth, around the sort of cans or the people standing there. You then progress to swimming and board paddling. And yeah, I won my first board race at 11 years old. I think I went on to win about 3 straight or something.
Oh, did you?
You know, it's a lot of contact in surf life saving. I think people don't realize. People are throwing elbows and you know, sort of pulling board straps back and all sorts of things. So it teaches you a lesson in resilience quite young.
Yeah, so you were the kid about town then. So from 11, 12, 13, you're going in, winning these state championships. Did you become a little bit of a face or a little bit of a celebrity within your small community of 2000?
I think maybe myself, I might have thought I was. But again, you know, your older sisters are pretty quick to pull you in line there and
humble you
and tell you exactly if ever you were to get too far ahead of yourself. But I was surrounded by about 5 females within our squad, constantly pushing me. You know, we would get our names in the paper and all that kind of thing was exciting. Our grandma would cut it out and put it on her wall, and we were so embarrassed to go over there. She had this wall of, you know, pride of all her grandchildren. And but yeah, I just happened to be surrounded by this amazing group of what happened to be females at the time. And even to get Sports Person of the Year, it took me until year 12 to get that because my sisters were winning it. So I had to step up. I had to raise the bar to actually get those awards on a local level, whereas I was winning Australian titles and not getting Best Sports Person of the Year. So yeah, you had to step up.
So by the sounds of it, your sisters were your biggest motivation and inspiration, but also your biggest competitors. You've got everything from your sisters. Then you've got the motivation, you've got the inspiration, you're watching them, so you're learning, you're growing from them. Then all of a sudden you're like competing against them. What was do you remember the first moment when you actually thought to yourself, right, I need to get above them, I need to surpass them and get to the next level? Was there ever a moment where you were like, I can do this?
There was actually, just as you said that, I remembered. So my sister Courtney and I were the ones who continued to do it more seriously, and my other sisters dropped out around 14. But it was when I reckon I was about 12 years old, and we were doing this run around the caravan park, and my dad actually helped train us, and he had all of these different little courses around Sawtell to run up and down hills, and it kind of grew from him being faster than us to us overtaking him and having to give him a bit of a head start. But you know, he said, give me 2 minutes, and we'd done that, and I was standing there, and I remember saying to Courtney something about winning more medals than her at the recent carnival. I said, oh, you know that I got more medals. This smart-ass little 12-year-old. And I just remember her looking at me almost with this death stare, and then it was on for that run. We were sort of competing against each other. But I think as a 12-year-old, you can be a little bit cheeky and, you know, kind of make those
cocky
jabs. And exactly. But as I got older, there never seemed to be any of that. I think once I say mature as a 14, 15-year-old, with how mature I was, I'm not sure. But we sort of always, like you said, had that healthy level of competition, that respect amongst each other. And I mean, when we were 17 and 18, we made the professional Nutri-Grain Series. So we were racing against each other with the best of the best.
Wow. When does it start to get really, really serious? When do you realize that, wow, you know, this is a step up, this could potentially be my career?
Totally. So Courtney and I moved to the Gold Coast when we were 17 and 18 respectively, and you have to do the trial to get in the Ironwoman Series. So it's a whole weekend. You do about 8 races. The points add up, so you can't have a bad race or you literally miss out. There's around 100 girls that line up to compete, and it comes down to the best 20 that get in. But in saying that 100 is full of top quality competitors. Just to get to that start line is really difficult. I think it was in Redcliffe. That's right. It was the dead flat waters of Redcliffe. So it was supposed to be at Kirra. It was 8-foot cyclone surf on the Gold Coast. So they held it in the dead flat, so it was even more brutal. And I remember that weekend desperately trying to stay in those top rankings. It was the first time I'd paddled a surf ski in the open competition. I was lining up between champions on either side. And at the end of the weekend, I looked on that list and I saw my name in that top 20. And even better, I scrolled up and saw Courtney's name there too. And 17 and 18, that was everything we ever wanted, was to be a professional Ironwoman, and we'd both gotten through on this same weekend. And I just remember the picture they took after. We were literally jumping for joy, and it was just a special seeing her name there, because I know how hard she'd worked too.
Yeah, and you talk about that hard work. Did you enjoy life? Were there a lot of sacrifices you made along the way in order to get to those levels where you're in the top 20 of this Ironwoman professional competition?
It is a really good question, because often, that's right, we so easily skip to the point where we made it, right? I remember in grade 10, so, we go through to grade 12 here in Australia, and in year 10 and 12, you have a formal or a graduation, because a lot of people don't go through to year 12, so they graduate, have a graduation year 10 too. And I remember it fell on the same weekend as a major carnival. The carnival was a selection for our state team, and I had to make that decision. That was the first time at the age of 15 I had to make that really big decision. Would I put a dress and heels on that weekend like all my friends, or put a pair of goggles on and put a foot on the line at this competition? And the choice was so easy. I remember stepping on that line that weekend, and I never regretted it once. And I think there was so many sacrifices, but I never saw them as that. You realize it's quite a sheltered upbringing. It is. And even with schoolies, after you're 12 it's on the Gold Coast, or it was at that time. Everyone kind of travels overseas and things now. But I only did one day of schoolies because it was in the middle of our surf life saving season. So a lot of my friends were going out and drinking and all sorts of things. And I just didn't want to do that. Mind you, when we got into that series and, after big competitions, we would certainly enjoy ourselves. But, in terms of sacrifices, you've got to train 2-3 times a day to make it as an iron person. It's absolutely brutal. Probably the sport I compare it to most is triathlon, in terms of balancing different disciplines. You've got your run leg on soft sand, you've got your swimming in the ocean, board paddling and ski paddling. And I tell you, if one of those legs is weak, you're not going to make it.
And I think what's really, really important, and just from your conversation there about, your teenage years, obviously you had a why. It seems like that you found that why pretty early on. What was your why that made you so disciplined and so focused at such a young age?
I've just never wanted to settle for, just not even normality, but just kind of the mundane. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I've just always wanted to, I've been such a from the age of, like we said, like 5, when I was kind of out with my sisters doing different crazy things, I've always been curious, and I've always wanted to push the limits. And that's why I had so many scratches and bruises on me as a child. And that's why, my parents had to pull me back, with that boogie board. And I remember at the age of 12, and Courtney and I were sitting at home, and we were watching, at that stage, it was the Middleton Ironwoman Series. And we saw Carla Gilbert, the absolute champion of the sport, for so many years, leading the girls around, running the transitions and winning these races. And we just looked at each other and we thought, we could do that. Why couldn't we do that? Let's do that. Let's move to the Gold Coast. And that vision was clear from such a young age. And I remember going to the Gold Coast, my first session, and looking along the skyline and seeing those high rises and being like, this is where I'm supposed to be. And I've had those moments throughout my career. I had it in my paddle around Australia where you stop, with sport, you're rushing and racing, but just the moment you stop and absorb it and go, this is exactly what I'm meant to be doing.
Yeah, this is exactly what I'm supposed to be doing at exactly this time. And everything just syncs and matches nicely. Almost the stars align. So when you get into the top 20, you and your sister, what's after that? Because now you realise that you're serious competitors. You're on a world stage here. It's like, did that sort of change your outlook? And did you give yourself a little pat on the back and go, right, listen, let's not sit the rest on our laurels. Let's go after it.
For sure. I think the first year or first season you're in that series, you do rest on your laurels a little. You are just super stoked to be there and be making up the numbers, right? And you're 17 years old and you don't know any better. And then after a couple of years of sort of running around with 5th and 6th, you think, all right, let's do it. It's time to step up even that little bit more. You physically develop. You get stronger, particularly on the ski leg. That was something I found really difficult, ironically, when I was younger, was always the ski leg. And you just start to have those breakthrough sort of wins here and there in a minor competition, or, you start leading races, and then, you're capable. And, in horse racing, they call it kind of soft wins. Like, you go to local carnivals, you get used to what it's like being in front. And I think our coach was really good at doing that. He said, as much racing as you can do is the best thing for you, because you get used to that competition environment. Your senses are heightened, all of those things. And you sort of normalize racing. It helps control the nerves.
You sort of normalize the unnorm. You talk about you didn't
right.
benefit. You sort of normalize the pain. You normalize the suffering. You start to enjoy the pain barriers that you hit. When you're going to hit them, right? So it is like you said about, you never wanted to be normal. I'm exactly the same. But you're normal by being sort of out of your comfort zone, by being sort of abnormal, right?
Yeah. And it's where you start to thrive. Like, the biggest highs I get, after you accomplish a challenge, or even a race where I've gotten absolutely smashed by the surf, nothing's gone my way, I still come off that beach on a high, pushing your limits. It's just, it's why people line up and do marathons and fun runs and push themselves, and at the end everyone's smiling and muddy and whatever it is. But yeah, it's the same in the surf. You turn up and you can be the best on the day and put in every single bit of work at training and do everything. And the surf has something else to say and throws you back to shore and throws you off your ski. And you've got to accept that. So from a young age, like, you're being taught these lessons in getting back up and going again.
Conditioned, right? Conditioned physically, psychologically, emotionally, And like you say, then self-belief kicks in the back end. You start to realize what you're capable of. And I heard you say, when you realize what you're capable of, it's like it gives you a right buzz. How does the competition go with your sister at this stage? Because you're side by side, right?
Absolutely. And there's races where you might be first and second, and that's amazing, and you're sharing the podium. But the next week, one of you's first and the other's 18th. So, it can be really hard when, my sister, and likewise with my training mates, if they got a win and you had a shocking day of racing and were at the back of the pack, you're trying to essentially hide your disappointment because you want to celebrate with them. They've just won one of the biggest competitions in the world, and it's their moment. So you don't want to show kind of those feelings or those negative feelings. So and you're all back in the pool the next day training together as well. But I think if you've done everything you can at training, you've left no stone unturned, your moment's coming. It might not be on that day, but it's coming and it will come. And the thing with the surf is, even though it can be the most brutal, Mother Nature can be, oh my goodness, brutal, and the lessons you learn can be really hard learned. You can be winning a race and have 10 people come down a wave behind you and come 11th, you can be winning that race by 10 meters and be the best on the day. But that the surf will always turn, and if you put the effort in, it will come back and you will have your moment.
Yeah, this is why I always talk about Ironmen and Ironwomen competitions being, I would say, the leading sort of physical, all-round sort of fittest woman on the planet, because not only are you fighting against yourselves, but you're fighting against the elements. People don't realize that, and that's why I've got maximum respect for Iron Men and Iron Women competitions, because it's the conditions that people don't realize. They go, yeah, you can push yourself physically, psychologically, and emotionally, but there's an element of luck. There's an element of that psychological game where you have to be on it. Like you said, you cannot have a bad moment, because you go from first to last, really, can't you? If it gets you, how hard is it to psychologically stay in the game and not let that overwhelm you?
It's so hard. By the end of an Iron person, you are fatigued, your technique's starting to drop, yet you're facing sometimes 6 to 8 foot swells. So you've got to pick the rating up. You've got to go and put that burst of speed on when what we call is the lull. So that's when the ocean goes flat in between the sets. It's called a lull. So when that lull comes, no matter how much pain you're in, you need to go, because that's your chance to get out in the back. and you don't always pick it right. So you can stand on the beach and study the conditions beforehand and think it's pulling out in a certain area, and then in the next hour it's changed. So, a moment I remember so clearly is racing in huge seas. It was about 8 foot down in Victoria, and I was in third position. I was behind my sister and one of the other top Ironwomen, and my coach said, follow them where they go into the rip. So I followed them into the rip on my board, and a girl went from 12th into first by running completely in the other direction and getting sucked out in a rip. So that day we got hammered by the swells. So even when you follow the best, it doesn't always work, but you've got to back your own decisions.
Why, Bonnie, why did you just think that it was a good idea? Why did you decide to think, right, do you know what? I'm going to paddleboard nearly 13,000 kilometers around Australia. How did you come up with that decision?
I know. And it's a funny one. I was always sort of a sprinter when I was younger. That was always my strength. But, in 2020, I picked up a book. The local library had just opened back up again. We'd come out of lockdown, and the book was called Fearless, and it was about Freya Hofmeister, the German woman who had the world record, right? She paddled around Australia in 2009, and I had never heard her story. And from a chapter in, I was reading about crocodiles stalking for 100 kilometres. I was reading about bumps from great whites, but it was like this gut feeling I had. It's hard. I almost describe it as a calling, like, I've got to do that. I've got to do that. And I hadn't had that since I was 12 years old and watched Carla Gilbert on the TV. And it was that same feeling, that curiosity of like, if I don't do it, I'm going to get to be this, how I say it, an old woman who regrets not having done it. I'm going to sit there and
your
think,
why has changed, right? It's like, that's why it's so
right.
important. Your why, now your purpose has changed, which is fresh. It excites you. It's refreshing. It gives you new goals, new attributes, new characteristics that you know that you're going to develop once you take on this challenge, right? So it excited you? It sounded like internally it excited you, like, here's my next challenge. Here's my next why. Here's my next purpose.
That was it. And a few years prior, I'd switched to become a specialist ski paddler. I remember the last Ironwoman session I did and just kind of putting the board away and going, I think I'm done with that. I think I've done everything I've wanted to do. I've pushed my limits in that space and I want to try something new. So I moved on to ski paddling, which I had no record of individual ski paddling as being a strength. And it was that same thing of almost starting something I wasn't amazing at, and that challenge of becoming excellent at it, that mastery. And there was no evidence I would be able to paddle around Australia. The furthest I'd paddled in the day was 50 kilometres. I was paddling 130K from 2 weeks in. So, to beat this record, it was 80 to 100K every day I'd have to paddle. I had absolutely no evidence. And when I was pitching to sponsors, I was pitching an idea in the middle of COVID, mind you, when budgets were tight. So I had to have that self-belief and go, I can do this and I will do this. And even though the doubt always crept in, it was like either side kind of battling. It was, I still knew, I had this feeling I knew I would get it done somehow, but it was never going to be pretty.
Who was the first person that you told and what was their reaction?
So my husband, Matt, was the first person, and I finished this book and I hadn't said anything about the book to him, and we were sitting on the couch and I looked at him and I said, I think I could do it. And sometimes I sort of start conversations with him as if assuming he knows what I'm talking about. I said, I think I could do it. He said, what's that? I said, paddle around Australia. I think I could do it. And he said, what on earth are you talking about? I said, I've been reading this book. And he said, oh, no. And he honestly, when I told him of the idea, he looked at me with a blank stare. He did not know what to say. I think he didn't want to say the wrong thing or kind of crush, my hopes. And I said, I'll revisit it in a few weeks. And 2 weeks later, he looked at me and said, you're not going to forget it, are you? And I said, no, you know me quite well.
He knows you. He knows
you. He
knows
me. And so Paul, like, we were planning this mid-COVID when the world was shutting down. There was always the risk that a COVID officer would step in front of us and say the borders of WA have closed and not allowed to get in anymore, Like, it was never a guarantee logistically that this could happen. I always had that in the back of my mind. But again, it raised the stakes, and I knew I had to get as many kilometres, get it done as quickly as I could so it could be done.
Was it something that you just thought, right, I could be the next woman to do this, gain the inspiration from the book and get out there and achieve this?
I think so. And I wanted to do it in a way that hadn't been done. So those prior had done it on like heavy skis, and kind of taking their time. And so I wanted to push the limits of human performance and see what could be done. Instead of 10 and a half months, I wanted to do it in 8 months. I wanted to be the first person to cross the Great Australian Bight. I had to go 500 kilometres out to sea at the bottom of the country. And people often ask, why? Why did you go so far out? And when you look at the map of Australia, it's far from a perfect circle. So by cutting directly across from headland to save as much distance as possible, but in doing that, I would have to go further out to sea on a surf ski than had ever been done before. And I can tell you it's terrifying that far out. The water changes from a beautiful turquoise blue to a dark, navy blue where, almost black in the middle of the day. You can't see your hand under the water. It's incredibly quiet out there. That's the thing that got me, was taking my earphones out. I was listening to music all day, and just the quiet, you can just hear the wind whistling, and, there's no birds out there. There's only mutton birds occasionally, huge albatross birds every now and then that come. But other than that, you've got no company but your support boat, which can only get within a couple of 100 metres on some days because the surf's so big. So that lack of social interaction all day, people ask me, was it harder mentally or physically? And the truth is, for the first 2 months, while my body conditioned, physically it was so tough.
Do you think that you underestimated the journey at certain stages?
100%. But in saying that, I think the naivety was a bit protective. You've probably had that feeling too. Like, you kind of think of the amazing feeling of, climbing to the summit and that feeling of standing, or for me, coming back and standing on the beach and knowing I'd covered every metre of coastline. It sort of protects you, because the truth is, by the end of the paddle, I couldn't straighten my fingers. I couldn't open a water bottle. I couldn't open the fridge door. I was, pretty much wincing in pain every time I had to, straighten my fingers, because they were locked in the position of holding a paddle all day. And I think if I would have known that, it would have taken away the excitement in the planning. So
absolutely.
Right. And you can probably relate to that. And if someone was to do this again, I'd love to help them in every way I could. But I also think not knowing what's coming can protect you just a little bit.
Eight months you were at sea. Now you skip from, I started off and then to the end, and I'm like, whoa, is this? Just talk me through the physical pain and the psychological resilience that's required, let alone the external dangers.
Totally. So in planning for this paddle, I remember opening my laptop and searching images and videos of crocodiles and sharks, because I knew in this paddle that at some stage I would see them, and I wanted to know what it would look like with one coming up to me in order to be able to stay calm on my ski, and knowing that the worst thing I could do is fall out of my ski, if one of those creatures showed interest. And I did. I had several times. I had a great white shark come up right next to me in Western Australia that I actually didn't see, that my crewmate saw. And they told me, desperately called me into the boat and told me when I got on. But I saw several sharks, even from the first week of paddling. They were following me down the east coast, tiger sharks, bull sharks. As we got down into the cooler waters of the south, the risk of a great white shark attack basically doubles and then triples. So I wanted to prepare
Oh, wow.
myself.
Is that due to the temperature, the water temperature?
Yes, yep. So the great white
Oh,
sharks in
got you.
Australia, yep, the cooler temperatures of the South Australia and Victoria. It's why there's sort of so many sightings. And there was an attack, last week there was an attack. A young boy was killed in an area where I paddled past and paddled in close to a young surfer. And, and then you go to Western Australia, and from about halfway up, the risk becomes the crocodiles, or sorry, a bit further north in Broome, that's where the crocodiles start. So every time you completed a certain section and went, good, like we're out of the cool waters, but now the crocodiles start in these waters that
How
can
do you
get
deal
to.
with that? How do you deal with that distraction? Because that's a huge distraction. But you've got to stay focused on the job at hand, right? You almost got to keep that out of your head, because that's a distraction that will finish everything, right? It's like, right, if you allow that to really settle in, and that seed of doubt to really engulf you, then that's your challenge over.
100%. And it's a point where people say that, I said, what gets you through? And number one, your crew is absolutely everything. Being able to debrief at the end of the day, and I think add a little bit of humor into it as well about the situation, and laughing at how ridiculous.
Humor in the face of adversity, right?
That's exactly right. I learnt that. And I think the other one is music helped me. I had my music in, and it felt almost like company in that way. And I would listen to these lyrics, and it almost felt like the person was there talking to me. And, people often say, what do you listen to? And I say, when you're in the middle of crocodile territory, you do not want to be listening to Vance Joy. I had Stormzy and Eminem pumping in my ears to get me through. But
Love it.
right? Like, you set the backdrop. It kind of made me feel invincible. And oh my goodness, after listening to Eminem 500 tracks, you kind of start to feel like you are him. But, you just get into the zone. And I know athletes will know, well, whether it's athletes or high performing corporates, it's that zone of where you just concentrate on that next bit you've got to do. And for me, that was breaking it down into, sometimes all I could look at was the next kilometer. I was in so much pain. I had so much lactic acid at times. It was just 1 kilometer, and slowly but surely you string together 140, 150K, and the furthest I did in 24 hours, 235K. So
yeah, but when you talk about it like that, you're breaking that leg down 235 times. That's why you achieve such high levels, because you have the mindset to be able to break it down like that. Not looking at the journey in its entirety, because if you do that, it's almost unachievable, right? It's breaking it down and then committing 100% to that stage, to that commitment. How important was it to just to go that kilometer, those few hundred meters to few hundred meters, in order to achieve nearly 13,000 kilometers?
Absolutely. It's everything. And it was something I kind of adapted early on in the trip when, people often say, did you feel like quitting? I said from week one, I felt like quitting. I would be sprawled out on the back deck, unable to talk. And I couldn't even consider even making it to, Victoria. I was like, I don't know how I'm going to get through a week, let alone 8 months.
But if you allow that to get into your head, right, if you would have thought about Victoria, I don't know how I'm going to get there, I'm never going to get there, and you allow that to become the forefront of your focus and of your mindset, you're not going to make it.
Exactly. That's right. It's all I would tell myself is, well, I've just got to get to the next anchorage. I've got to get to the next anchorage. And I had the skipper telling me each day where I had to get to. And the thing was, right, the plan was often 90 kilometers, for example. The skipper would come out halfway through the day and say, Bonnie, it's actually 130 kilometers because the wind's changed. It's no longer safe at that anchorage. We've got to go to the next one. So I would have to paddle an extra 40, 50 kilometers in the day to get to the safe anchorage. And I knew that my crew was amazing and they were doing everything, but I was the only one who could do those strokes to get to the next anchorage. And it felt, while it some days felt like a burden, it was also a privilege to have that kind of like, the pressure is a privilege. It sort of felt like that. I thought everything I've learnt throughout my whole life about since the age of 12, when my coach told me in swimming training to just look at each lap and do the best job you can and concentrate on your technique, all of that came into it when I felt my body, start to deteriorate. It was, let's get the best we can out of this kilometre. You might feel good in the next kilometre. You don't know, but if you stop now, you'll never know. So it was always just pushing for one more. And I remember when I saw the skyline of the Gold Coast paddling back, it was the first time in the paddle I let my emotions go and started laughing, and I kind of threw my head back and tears started rolling down because it felt like the monkey was off the back. Before that, I sort of had to keep my emotions in check to some degree, and I did break down at different times for my crew, but it kind of was just focusing on one bit at a time allowed me not to get overwhelmed.
And how did you deal with, because a lot of people don't realise this, but you mentioned you had bulging discs in your back. God, talk about overcoming and sort of having to push that to one side in order to complete the enormity of the task. How did you get through that? How did you deal with that?
A lot of people ask how I physically prepared for this. I actually put on 15 kilos in 6 months leading in. I knew I wouldn't be able to meet the 8,000 calories or so a day required. I lost all that weight throughout and was really grateful when I was down south and I couldn't hold food down. I was grateful for that extra weight. It's what my body used basically as fuel. So across the bite, I held pretty much no food down for 14 days other than fluid and tiny bits of fruit here and there. Electrolytes was a priority. But basically from day 2 in, I was projectile vomiting. Sorry if anyone's eating their dinner or lunch, but vomiting out the side of my ski. And at the start, I was only vomiting on the boat. And I said, my ski is my safe place. I'm good. And then once I started vomiting on the ski, it was just all day, every day. Out there, you can't anchor the boat. So it's like being on a roller coaster. You're in huge seas, and I never felt so depleted in my life, but I still had to hit the 100-kilometre targets because the longer you're out in that bite, the bigger chances the Arctic winds from the Antarctic of coming up and you get stuck in a storm out there. There's no help coming for a few days. You're out of helicopter range. It's just you and your crew. And as I said, I was the only one who could cover those strokes. And Guinness World Records, you've got to cover every metre. So we would mark where I'd get out and have to motor back to that exact spot. It was ugly and disgusting and gritty, but I am so immensely proud of it.
And also, I suppose, on a technical point of view, you're almost, banking those kilometres as well, because you never know, like you said, you're doing 140. Well, that's probably 40 banked just in case you have a horrendous day where you only do 80, right? What was the last day like?
It's on every day was such a roller coaster of emotions, but I remember that last day just feeling pure joy and ecstasy.
How many kilometres did you have to cover?
Do you know, I only had to do 10 kilometres on the last day, so that probably had something to do with it. And, I was given our deadline of the 28th of August. We arranged all of, the news to be there, all of my friends and family and sponsors. So I actually had a deadline to get back to the Gold Coast, and we had in the southeasterly trade winds that time of the year. I was pushing into 50 to 20 knots a day. That's like a huge fan in your face every day. Yep. I know you know what that's like, pushing into headwinds. And, I was paddling half the distance with twice as much energy as the tailwinds. But when I kept saying to my crew, I want one day off before the finish just to regather my thoughts. I got that day in the Gold Coast Seaway to myself, a bit of pampering, and then the final day, that paddle, I had a bunch of people join me, my loved ones, and coming into the beach on the Gold Coast there. And it's just hard to explain the feeling of the sand between my toes and just walking up that beach. And, the beautiful part was looking along that skyline. That's the same skyline when I first moved to the Gold Coast as an Ironwoman that I trained along. And it was like coming full circle, that it was just meant to be. And I know we've talked about that moment of feeling like everything led to that point, and that in that moment you were meant to be there. I had that once again.
And the world records that you broke during that challenge. What were they?
Yeah, so I became the fastest overall to circumnavigate Australia on a surf ski. I became the first Australian woman to do it, and the youngest, though they don't recognise the youngest anymore as a world record, which is, I think there was a bunch of children throughout the world sort of doing dangerous things, so they actually don't ratify youngest.
For me, that's the most impressive. It's the most impressive. Wow.
Totally. And technically, I'm still going to claim Guinness World Records might not ratify it, but I'm going to claim youngest.
100%. 100%.
What I'm very, very proud of is 2 weeks after I circumnavigated Australia, I found out that the male record in 24 hours was 228 kilometres. The furthest I'd paddled was 213 kilometres in 24 hours. I'd broken the women's record, which was 150 kilometres prior. So I found out the men's record was 228, and I looked at my husband again and I said, I've got an idea. And he said, oh,
like,
no, I think was the words. Yeah. And I said, we've got to get the crew back together. We went up to Townsville in North Queensland, and I managed to break the men's record and do 235 kilometres in 24 hours. So that's something I'm extremely proud of, because I had to do that with bulging discs.
You are one hardcore woman. Wow. I take my hat off to you. Really, really, really impressive. Talk to me about Got You for Life, because that was a big motivator of yours, wasn't it?
Yeah, they're amazing. So through COVID, people might know this, but the statistics of anxiety and depression and suicide was rising, and really scarily amongst the youth groups was rising rapidly. And it's because we weren't socially connected. People were isolated. People were in their homes and not able to go to work and hang out with their friends. And I wanted to do some good with this project. I wanted to break a world record. I wanted to share the journey. So we took videographers, and I wanted to do some good. And I thought, what better cause than mental fitness and mental health to raise money for and raise awareness for? I'd heard about Gotcha for Life and went onto their site, researched them. They use terms like emotional muscle, and I love they teach school children about building mental fitness and say it's never too young to start. So I am so glad we raised $120,000 for them. But most importantly, everyone who donated went to their page, saw what they're about, and I'm an ambassador and helped deliver those workshops. So in terms of coming full circle, that has as well. So it was a really special part of the journey and helped get me through as part of my why as well.
Amazing, Bonnie. So what's next for you?
Yes, so I actually have a book coming out.
A signed copy sent my way, please.
Absolutely. It's called The Girl Who Touched the Stars. It's about my circumnavigation around Australia and takes a deep dive into what it takes mentally and physically to do that, where my mind went, what got me through, and the importance of crew and the people that you have around you. So I'm so excited to share it with everyone and to share the journey in such depth.
Listen, I'm definitely going to be getting it. I can officially give you the title of the most hardcore woman on the planet. But listen, Bonnie, it's been great to talk to you. To be in that mindset and in that zone for so long is so important. But like you said, breaking things down, really putting 100% into those stages and those moments, with no distractions is what's needed to get to success in your own right.
Thank you so much for having me. So great to chat.
My guest today was Bonnie Hancock. Find out more about her new book, The Girl Who Touched the Stars, in the show notes. Thanks so much for joining me on Head Game. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of our incredible stories, and leave me a review wherever you're listening. I'm Middleton. Catch you again next time.